really should have brought that. I know. I met them all last night. Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for trekking to the furthest venue and for one of the first sessions of the day. Welcome to Newsrooms of the World Unite, Finding a Global Solution to Misinformation. I just wanted to start. Okay, I need to talk closer. Just wanted to start by introducing the panel next to me. So next to me here is Mandy Jenkins, who is Editor-in-Chief of Storyful. Then Mira Milosevic, Director of the Global Forum for Media Development. Chris Elliott, the Director now of the Ethical Journalism Network. And Ezra Eman, who is Head of Digital for the European Broadcasting Union. We are going to talk about misinformation and finding a global solution. This is something that we have been between us discussing for quite a few months now. And so today we actually wanted to make an announcement. So we're kind of starting backwards by announcing this thing that we have to talk about today, and then we'll go in and talk about global solutions to misinformation. This first started a few months ago when I got very frustrated at a few conferences, people talking about fake news, a lot of money going to US-only institutions to tackle misinformation, and also attending some inspiring sessions at newsrooms in different places who have been fighting misinformation for decades, not just 18 months. And so I decided to get in touch with a few people, some quite important people, and ask if they wish to join together to try and tackle this. So the most important thing I have to say here is that this is not another initiative. Not another initiative. There are so many initiatives out there that we have no desire to create a new initiative. This is not a brand new way of tackling misinformation. What we are announcing is a global council to restore trust in media and fight misinformation. And this council is founded by all of the organizations represented up here, plus the Global Editors Network and One IFRA. And I think we definitely have someone from the Global Editors Network in the room, and hopefully someone from One IFRA as well. So, what is the mission of this non-initiative, but of this council? Quite simply, it's to restore trust in media and fight misinformation, so quite a clear and simple, hopefully easy to achieve goal. But in reality, it's not so easy because there have been so many different efforts across the world in order to tackle this. You are probably aware every time you log onto social media, someone will announce another one. One of the really real differences between the way that these initiatives have emerged is to do with funding models. So I'm not bashing the US, but they have been very fortunate in having a lot of foundations which support innovation, especially in the fight against misinformation. Whereas elsewhere, we've been getting on with it. There is no specific money for creating new initiatives. We've had to build it into workflows, into new hires, into creative thinking. So there are a lot of people doing these things, and what we are trying to do with this council is to make sure that everyone is connected, that all of the initiatives are connected, and that everyone knows what they are doing. So we have 4 pillars. It wouldn't be a non-initiative if there weren't pillars. And so we've decided on 4 pillars. And the first pillar is to create a repository for all of the initiatives out there and all of the best practice and funding opportunities that might exist to tackle misinformation. We are very aware that duplication is a huge problem, and during our discussions around the framing of this, many people were saying, well, there are so many things, but I don't know what's going on. And actually, we were duplicating the work that someone else was doing. If we'd have known that, we could have perhaps worked together. So we will be working together to create a repository that lists all of these initiatives, funding opportunities, guides, associations, anyone who is involved in this effort. And I've got an example of what this looks like. So this is a proof of concept that we have put up on the website, which I will share with you in a moment. But the idea is that we will start collecting information from everyone that we can through our respective networks for each respective organization and directly through the site in order to map as many of these as possible and make that information available to as many people as possible. We're also, so this is what it looks like there are lots of collaborations and coalitions. The Trust Project is one. The Journalism Trust Initiative is another. We want you to see all of them side by side. So there are two ways that people can submit their initiatives. I'm sure some of you have got some that you would like to see included pretty quickly. You can directly submit it through the website that we've created, but you can also communicate directly with a founding member if you have an affiliation with them, and that is available to do through the site. We'll also be sharing more information in coming weeks as to how you can share what you're working on. Getting 6 organizations together to agree on a single goal has been quite an interesting experience. And I'm glad we got there. But we're now very much still in the framing period of this. So we are looking at our long-term strategy for hosting, curating, vetting, submitting and disseminating the information through something like a repository. We have also had some discussions between us about how much there is a strong desire to get as much of this information out there as possible and make it be public. But actually, when it comes to funding opportunities or people wanting to share that kind of sensitive information in order to consolidate budgets or work out how they can get more out of what they've got, we understand that sometimes that there might be a need to communicate a little bit more discreetly. So we just need to find out that balance to share as much as possible, but at the same time allow for real change. And we're also meeting this week to try and map out the further development stages. The second pillar is about really creating, we've got 6 organizations here who have between them hundreds of publishers and broadcasters, and we want to try and connect all of those organizations, all of the organizations that they represent, to as many of the funding initiatives, projects as possible. So we'll be trying to do a little bit of matchmaking when we start to analyze this. We'll be doing that centrally, but also as individuals, because we'll all have access to this repository. So the idea is to connect individuals, organizations, and initiatives across as wide a network as possible. We also think that by doing this, we will make funding, the limited amount of funding for these initiatives, go further by perhaps identifying where people may be able to team up or where people may be able to pick up where others leave off once they reach the end of their project, so that we're constantly moving forward. An example of this, oh, that's very fast, but that wasn't supposed to be so fast. That's terrifying. But these three initiatives have a lot of similarities. They all know each other exist because they are big players in this game. What we want to do is find similar initiatives and make sure that that they know what they are doing. And by analyzing the data in the repository as it comes into us, we should hopefully be able to make those connections. The third pillar is to really club together to work out how we might best innovate on this. I am sure many of you're going to be going to many sessions where we talk about misinformation, where we try and identify it, where we try and determine what fake news is. What we want to do is use the innovation efforts that exist within the organizations to connect them together and come up with ways to move forward, to really build on the work that each other is doing. And then finally, before I ask each member to kind of explain about their organization and their approaches to misinformation and the need to tackle it globally, the final pillar is really to perhaps allow a group like this to speak more, to set some kind of agenda for the way that we speak about this topic. So often the news industry is pulled into other people's conversations, whether it's platforms, technology, advertising industry, and we are asked to respond. There is very rarely an opportunity for the news industry itself to say what it feels about this, and perhaps this council may be in a position in the future to be able to speak with a voice on that. So I want to dive into why, some case studies as to why we did this. But if you want to find out more, all of the information that I've just spoken about is on the website for this council, globalmis.info. And I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to talk about the Ethical Journalism Network. Okay, it's on, just speak quite closely. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm already suffering from slide envy. I'm afraid I won't have any of those things going around like that. So I already feel a little bit out of place. I want to talk a little bit about the Ethical Journalism Network and what it is. It's fundamentally, I mean, I've already been to one session this morning where we're talking about misinformation, and actually misinformation is at the heart of what the ethical journalism is trying to counter. It's what it's trying to do in its work around the world. It's a group of professional journalists from around the world who hope to promote ethics, good governance, and good journalism. And we try to do this in a fairly practical way. This is our basics. This is the basic tests we use for the work that we do. We believe that journalism is about accuracy and independence and no propaganda. And of course, when we think about misinformation, I'll come very briefly to fake news later, but if you like, fake news, and we have our own definition of it, but it's only one aspect of misinformation. It's actually about propaganda as well. And in the work of the Ethical Journalism Network, where, we've got programs in the Balkans, the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere, we're trying to come up with practical ways that help and enable journalists not to be caught out by that kind of thing. The program of training, education, and research is given by people who are well trained, and it's there really to try and help journalists around the world and people who want to do their journalism better understand the world around them. What we've done is we've got, for instance, we've developed 5-point tests. So this is our core view of journalism, and we have things like 5-point tests for hate speech and for the coverage of migration. All of these are things which currently are things which you could put in the basket of misinformation. So we would say to people, look, you know, when you're looking at something and you suspect it's hate speech, you should be looking at the status of the speaker, the reach of the speech, the intentions, etc. And in all of these things, we're trying to encourage journalists to engage, to think, and we hope that we're going to give them that sort of tool which enables them to think about it. Now, obviously, fake news has kind of gathered the headlines. It's one of those things where you've got a story rumbling along for ages and ages and ages, and then all of a sudden, bang, something comes up. And sort of 18 months ago, this phrase, this thing called fake news suddenly appeared. And first of all, we thought that's what President Trump was giving us. Then he told us that's what we were giving him. And the whole idea of it became really rather muddy. And so I would argue that we needed to have a point at which we start from. And our start is this, that this is the deliberate fabrication of information with the intention to deceive and to mislead others into believing falsehoods or to doubt verifiable facts. Now, you know, I think that gives us a start, but it's only one part, as I say, of misinformation. So what we were looking at, when we were in Africa, I was in Abuja about 3 weeks ago, and we were there with colleagues, journalists from about 15 countries in West Africa, and we were looking at a whole series of programs. But one of the things that came up was the difficulties they had all faced when covering elections. And they had a massive problem with misinformation and propaganda. And there was a very, very interesting and good colleague from Gambia who was talking about, look, there are ways you can deal with this. And I think one of the crucial things that Fergus was talking about earlier was the need for collaboration, for bringing people together. And I felt that that was really, really key. And so I just thought I almost said the words share with you. I thought I'll tell you some of the things that we were doing. So what we hope to do is we are working with media groups to create a set of reporting guidelines and hate speech glossaries. Glossaries is something that we do when we find that hate speech glossaries begin to unpick language, which are triggers for very serious trouble. And a lot of that relates to misinformation. Because, for instance, in the UK, we had a situation where a columnist in the largest selling national newspaper described all migrants as cockroaches. Now, clearly that's misinformation. It demeans the whole issue, which is set in international law, of refugees, and therefore I think it classically, without obviously, fulfills the argument of misinformation. So what our colleagues from West Africa found was that they see quite a lot of that in the run-up to elections. Very powerful groups who own their own newspapers using language which is clearly misinformation. So we're setting up hate speech glossaries ahead of this year's elections in Gambia, 2018, Nigeria, which is in 2019, Mali in September 2018, and Senegal in February 2019, and Togo in July 2018. And we also hope to do it elsewhere in the region. Now, we hope that these guidelines are going to be based on the lessons learnt in Gambia, Ghana and Liberia, where activities and programs to improve reporting and counter misinformation included codes of conduct for election reporting, distributed to all the journalists, made available in printed booklets, and including agreements with broadcasters about balance. And if you remember that the killings in Rwanda, I've seen a couple of research projects which suggest that up to 15 to 18% of all the deaths were blamed on the kind of broadcast that came from a couple of radio stations. That may not be news to many of you, but I think sometimes you have to keep reminding yourself of that. Obviously, we hope to bring everyone together in multi-stakeholder meetings before the elections so that we can bring journalists, security services. And it's very interesting, again, I was in Sarajevo about a month ago, and there's an EU program to bring judges and journalists together to try to understand each other's language, because at the moment in Bosnia-Herzegovina, they have 173 live libel cases. And a lot of that is about language. So we also hope there's going to be effective self-regulation through media councils and others. But what we really hope is that the guidelines and the training should encourage proper scrutiny of the manifesto commitments of all parties. Proper scrutiny means cutting through the misinformation. Analyse what effect they'll have on citizens, check claims by politicians through fact-checking initiatives. And my other view is that this is not that digital, but one of the things that we could make is infinitely better access to verifiable fact-checking organisations. And I do think that's some work that can be done. And avoid only focusing on polls, personalities and controversy. So I'm going to stop at this point because I just want to talk about something where we're trying to embed best practice at the EJN. And part of that best practice is to make sure that people will have more of a sense of what misinformation is. They'll know the signs, and they'll have some of the mechanisms and the tools to spot it.
Thank you, Chris. Ezra.
Thank you very much. If you see me running out before 12, that's because the festival planned me somewhere else at 12. But it's not because I want to leave this council. I'm very happy that we're part of this, not initiative, but council. For some of you, and I might steal the clicker here, see how this works. So the EBU that's an acronym for the European Broadcasting Union. And if you don't know them, we're within our organization, we represent members, public broadcasters, who operate almost 2,000 televisions, radio, and online channels, reaching an audience of more than 1 billion people across Europe and beyond. And a lot of what they do, of course, at the core of these companies is news, making news, informing their audiences. And together our members operate 185 TV and radio services dedicated to news and current affairs. So the whole issue of misinformation is really top of our mind. And what brings us together is that our members share the same values. They share the having universality, togetherness, fairness, truthfulness, tolerance across borders. And what unites them is their goal to serve their communities from a public commitment perspective, including everyone, not just making news for a few, having open and free news, and meet the democratic, cultural, and social needs of Europe. And that's what unites them. So we also provide them with these editorial principles and guidelines, and that's something that we can do as an organization, set a few recommendations out there, how to work and how to inform audiences and citizens. So what do we do about it? What do we do as EBU about it? How can we contribute as organization, and how do our members contribute to the fight of misinformation? I think the EBU believes that the online presence of public service media is vital to support informed citizenships and represent an essential tool to fight the propagation of fake news. Reliable, quality journalism is the hallmark of what we do, and we are taking important steps to support that. On a very basic and day-to-day level, we provide our members with the skills and knowledge to verify news. I know Fergus has done verification news workshops with our members and in our newsrooms. And we give workshops, we give on-site training, helping members to identify and verify news. The Eurovision News Desk has a dedicated service of verifying user-generated content, because there's so much content coming out there, and not all newsrooms have the resources to verify this. We have this central hub where we verify a lot of UGC and make sure that what's put out there is verified and trusted information. We have a strong community of fact-checkers that we're building, who are connecting with each other to learn from each other. How do you verify news? What are best practices around that? How can we work better together around this? We collect best practices. We have, and I will show a few of the examples, because we have an overview of all of our members and what they're doing, and we can share these formats and say, this works in a specific country, maybe you could try this as well, this is how you implement this is the kind of resources you need to make it happen. But we're also involved in the policy-making progress, because it's a two-pronged approach. You can do things yourself, but you also have to weigh on the policy-making as well. And currently, the EBU is chairing the high-level group on fake news, trying to come up with recommendations for the European Commission, like how could we put things in place to combat fake news? What are the responsibilities of platforms in this? Are we needing rules or regulations, or do we need a kind of commitment around certain principles for them? These are things where we can weigh in and have a perspective from multiple of our members. We also have joined the Journalism Trust Initiative, which is a big initiative that really tries to define the standards of trust. Because if you talk about trust and quality, and you want that platforms give a higher ranking on trusted sources, you have to define it. You have to define what's fake news, but you also have to define what's a trusted source and how would we make that more prominent. And that's very important as well to define this. We're very happy to join this council because it gives a better overview. Just before the session, we talked about, like, is there already a definition of misinformation? And actually, there are some documents out there, but it's not always clear where all these different resources are, and it's a very scattered landscape. And I think the repository will really help to bring all these things together, create a better overview of what's already there, but also the work that still has to be done. And there's still a lot of things that we have to do. And the last thing that we do as EBU from a general perspective is trying to talk also with these GAFA players, with these platforms, ensuring that they know what we stand for, what our values are, and what we need them to do to make sure that our values also come across on their platforms. Because we can control our own platforms, what we don't control is how our news is presented on Facebook, on Google, these other platforms. And we need to make sure that they understand this, that we need some prominence, that we need a distinction between trusted sources and misinformation on these platforms. And they don't always understand it, and we need a dialogue, because you have the kind of carrot and stick approach, and we try to do both. So that's what we do on an EBU level. But of course, we have all our members who are in their distinctive organization in their countries, have their own initiatives to fight fake news, fight misinformation, and inform their audiences. And I would say there's two big categories. The one is really trying to fight misinformation, but another and really crucial aspect of this is also really trying to educate and involve people in media literacy. Because it's not just trying to, if people don't understand how news is made and how news is consumed, then just fighting the fake news, which is currently made with bots and algorithms, it's a game that we might not win. I'm quite convinced that you need the two approaches, and the initiatives or the examples I brought show you that you can do it both ways. I just have three short examples. One is France Info. They're having a very interesting format where it's called L'Instant Detox, and it's doing kind of fighting misinformation and debunking of fake news on the street with the audience, and it's on social media. So you can see it live on Facebook, and it's bringing facts to the street and having a dialogue about it with people on the street. So it's a very involved process where your audience is not just seeing you like, this is misinformation. No, the process is actually an understanding is built together with the audience. So that's a really nice format. What they also do is then, on the other side, giving this really practical advice so to the things that can help and make a difference in your daily life. How do you identify fake news? How can you fight against it? What are some really short and precise rules to look at information, and making it very tangible and very hands-on. The second example I brought here today is from Finland, from Ulle. They have this Faktana Kiitos, and this is a media literacy project, and I really like it because it goes to the heart. It doesn't wait until people come out of school and already somehow shaped. They go to the schools and really bring learning about news and how news is made directly to the school. They invest a lot of time bringing their journalists to the schools and involving students and youngsters in making news themselves and understanding what's the process, but also how this process might be sometimes tampered with, where misinformation rises. So it's a very involved and nice process, bringing news making to schoolrooms. And as a last example, because I don't want to only point to the usual suspects, you know, the big players like BBC or France or Germany or the Nordics, who are very advanced in this. This is from Latvia. It's a very simple but effective lie detector website where they debunk facts, statements from politicians, and they really say like how truthful they are in a very simple way. So it's not always with the big numbers, not always with the big resources. Some small things can help as well. And making that available to our members and see this is some small initiative you can take to fight misinformation that really helps to scale it across Europe. and that's why we are very involved in this council as well.
Thanks, Ezra. I think we're going to turn to Mira now. Although this is already, so far I'm writing notes furiously because I think we already have other categories that for the repository, and your France 24 example is something that I haven't seen a list of kind of output structures, story structures that work and inform audiences. So we'll add that as a category as well.
Thank you, Fergus. And thank you all for coming today. We're sorry we don't have more chairs. I am Mira Milosevic, Executive Director of Global Forum for Media Development, and I see a lot of our members here today. And most of them will be speaking over the next couple of days, so you will hear more about their work from them. But we are fortunate enough to have more than 190 members from more than 17 countries around the world. And since the network was established in 2005, we've connected thousands of journalists and international development and philanthropy around the world. It's a very specific network. It started as a network of organizations working to support journalism and media development in developing post-conflict countries and emerging markets. However, today, as we all know, as the business model for journalism is challenged in so many ways, philanthropic and donation-based support for journalism is becoming one of the core models for the future of journalism. And when speaking about misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, this is something that all our members share. We believe, of course, in freedom of expression and right to express, but we also believe that the core to fight misinformation, the core to fight all these problems of trust that we are facing today is actually by supporting and making sure we have a solid basis for journalism in the future. And that's what a lot of our members do. So for instance, this is about us. I'll share some of the examples. Unfortunately, don't have time to share all of them. But for instance, two of our members that are investigative journalism networks, Organization for Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting and Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, are the examples of new forms of governance for journalism. And you'll hear from them, from Drew and from colleagues, investigative journalists around the world about their investigative work, about the impact they're making, but very rarely you hear about how they're organized and what structure the organizations have and how they are managing to support and survive, support their work with 18 to 20 donor-funded projects throughout the year, with all the separate project proposals, then running the projects according to different budget lines, and then reporting to all those donors. So we had the business model for journalism that was established over 100 years, where you knew where your income came from, you were independent from advertisers, you got the money for advertising, then use it in the newsroom to your liking. It's much more complicated. Donor and philanthropy-based support for journalism sometimes take 30 to 40% on overheads on managing the project. So in order to make this a viable proposition for the journalism of the future, one of the things that all our members are looking at is how to make philanthropy and donor-based support more efficient. So one of the things that our members are doing, for instance, in the International Center for Journalism, is looking also at how newsrooms and journalists are dealing with all these new digital challenges. And Joyce is here, and she'll be speaking in one of the sessions in the festival as well, I think today. She can tell you more about it. But interestingly enough, when we measure what a success is in terms of our content, journalistic content, what their survey has discovered is that still today, 70% of newsrooms around the world, and it's very representative, use single metrics and use very simple measure like page views and unique users. And for journalists to be able to produce and fund serious content, we need to come up with a more sophisticated metrics. And I'm sure Mandy can tell more about it from the Online News Association. What are the efforts, and many of our members are doing that, trying to find ways not only to show to advertisers that page clicks and views are not actually any kind of a certain indicator of success of the content, but we also need to work with philanthropy to make sure that the donors understand that numbers on the website don't necessarily show engagement and metrics. So that's one of the aspects of the stories that we share, trying to see how the future would look like. Advertisers have today programmatic advertising. I mean, it's so automated, and it works on a very sophisticated level. We are still, when we're talking about philanthropy funding for journalism, at a level of filling out a lot of forms and a lot of very kind of time-consuming work that sometimes we are struggling to prove our impact. So this is something that we are also working on with our members. We are very happy to be part of this initiative because we aim to connect different initiative, non-initiative, to be part of this council, because we want to connect all the different efforts that are happening around the world. One of our members, Internews, is working with the support from Integrity News Initiative, also to address the challenges of misinformation, but also this business model for local news. And this is the group of organizations and companies that are working with them on that. I think that you will be hearing more about this in the future. They're also collaborating with World Economic Forum, trying to get businesses to recognize the ways that they advertise with credible media companies. Some interesting models there. Of course, one of our members is the European Journalism Center, again, here in Perugia, that are working with different partners on enhancing philanthropy and support for journalism. We have a lot of members around the world who are doing fantastic projects on fighting misinformation. We have Media Diversity Institute here. We have Women in News initiative from WANIFRA also will be presented in Perugia. This is from Fundación Gabriel Garcia Marquez in Colombia, and their project of debunking false information through their page on Facebook. So the bottom line is the only way to address all these issues is to work together, and also to make sure we create institutions and we create mechanisms to make sure journalism has a future, and we can only do this together. Thank you.
Thanks, Mira. And I see lots of you writing frantic notes and taking photos of the screen, but don't worry, there will be a repository where all of these initiatives are hosted, so that solves that.
All right, and you won't need to take photos of the screen because I don't have any slides. In addition to my day job at Storyful, I am the president of the Online News Association, and in my defense, we are the newest part of the council, so we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that. But if you're not familiar with ONA, we're the largest association of digital journalists in the world, which has now become kind of a loaded term because I think most of us are in some way digital journalists, which has really been great for ONA because we're a rapidly growing organization. Fergus noted at the top of this how so many conversations and a lot of the funding about misinformation is very focused within the US, and as the American on the panel, I'm really cognizant of that. But ONA is a US-based organization, but we've been growing rapidly around the world. So we have chapters in several other countries, including a very active chapter in Italy. So shout out to anyone here from ONA Italy. It's a great group. We always get together when we're here. So if you want to join us, let me know. But what we do at ONA, I mean, it's much more kind of a member-based organization on the individual sense than it is a company sense, which is a little different from some of the others up here. But we have more than 2,500 members around the world, and we're really a gathering point more than anything for people who are, they're journalists, they're innovators, platforms, technologists, but also, most importantly, the funders of bringing people together who have similar ideas, who want to build something, and connecting them with funding around that. Has been very, very much a part of ONA's mission since our inception 17 years ago. And that was back in the dark ages of digital journalism, which is now a much bigger thing. So, for us, this is very much something that makes sense because we have a pretty wide range of members, all different levels of their organizations, and they are all working towards more about the innovation and sustainability of journalism at large, not just in digital formats, but in all formats. And it's very much a part of what we're getting to here, where we want to connect our membership to the initiatives that are going on around the world. It's very easy for, especially people in the US, I'll be the first to admit, to think that fake news started and ended in just a couple of years ago in the United States. But we're very well aware, everyone up here, that the issues of misinformation have been tackled and been fought, and small victories aside, still very much a large issue in many, many parts of the world. There are organizations who have been working against this. I think of like Stopfake in the Ukraine. It was a great inspiration for a lot of the work that I think has grown from that around the world. They've been dealing with this for years, long before anyone, including the president of my country, was talking about it on Twitter. This is very much something that we want to be sure that we're connecting our members to things that have already been tried, maybe getting into some issues that have already started up in other countries, but also being able to lend some of the support of our organization into these initiatives that are going on elsewhere. Because we do work very closely with platforms, with technologists, and again, some of the US-based funders who may not have necessarily been paying attention to a lot of the things that have been going on in other parts of the world. But for one thing, if you want to learn more about ONA, our website's easy to remember. It's journalist.org. It was a great URL by 15 years ago, back before anyone was thinking about that sort of thing. And just to know a little bit more about us and how we've gotten involved in this, I mentioned the localized chapters around the world. We're definitely setting up a few of those here. We were just talking about trying to expand a few while we're here in Perugia. We're doing a great deal of training and knowledge sharing, both at the local level, but also at our international conference. If you guys happen to be in the United States in September, the ONA conference every year is a magnificent gathering point of everyone who's doing something really innovative and interesting in journalism. I highly recommend coming. It's a great time. It'll be in Austin, Texas in the beginning of September. But also just making sure that, if you want to talk to me a little bit about what we're doing, how you might want to get involved, I'm happy to do so. I'm easy to find. I will be right here after this session. But one of the ways that we've gotten involved in this in recent years, as an organization, ONA is not necessarily out there doing a lot of these initiatives because we are kind of a collection of members more so than we're going to be undertaking some of these efforts ourselves. But something that Fergus and I were both involved in a couple of years ago, which is kind of a symbol of being a part of this, was developing a social news gathering ethics code that was put together through a collection of people who are working in that field. It was us at Storyful, Fergus, Eric Carvin, who was at the AP and is also on the ONA board with me. Lots of us came together to work on essentially setting out some ground rules for how news organizations should be approaching social news gathering with an approach specifically focused on transparency and verification. And that sort of effort of putting out those resources for newsrooms to then take in and use their own ethics codes to be built into that is very much an example of how ONA wants to be able to be a part of global non-initiatives such as this. We don't want to be the ones that are out there building, but again, connecting people who are already building. So it's very much right at the heart of what we're trying to do too.
Thanks, Mandy. Before I throw it open to the audience, I just wanted to come to you with some questions, but also I wanted to say that we have 4 of the organizations represented here. There are 2 other organizations who are in the room, which is the Global Editors Network and One IFRA. They are also a part of this. So those of you who came in at the beginning, after the beginning, wouldn't have heard, but they are also on this council. I wanted something I think that Ezra said that was really interesting was identifying. By mapping everything out, we're able to identify the gaps in the fight against misinformation, or even the regions where there are gaps. And I just wanted to get the opinion of the panel. And are there any clear gaps that you have identified, or any clear regions that you've identified where efforts need to improve quite quickly, or that we should look to kind of reach out to quite quickly?
I can definitely speak to that for one thing to start, that I know, especially for us at Storyful, but we've also seen it through ONA, that really the impacts of misinformation in Asia at large, it's massive to say Asia, but I mean it is all across Asia and really the South Pacific and APAC at large. There are so many different, I guess, governmental issues, regulatory issues, and really just the rapid development of social media and digital media happening at the same time, that I think it very much needs to be a focus of all of us to be looking at what's happening there and what we can be, again, connecting with membership there too.
It's, is it on? Yeah. Our experience is that it's everywhere, and that some of the smaller countries have much larger problems than what we hear from US and UK and Europe. And just this morning, Maria Reza from Rappler was talking about the experience of Philippines and how everything that happens in US actually happens in Philippines at least 6 months in advance. And I know from Balkans and experiences in different countries there that the problems with bots and these kind of huge campaigns from different political parties was happening there 3 or 4 years ago. So by giving more attention, more visibility, and taking more care of what is happening there, I think we will be addressing all the issues in a much better way.
I hesitate to talk about anywhere in the Balkans with Mira sitting next to me, but I was in Kosovo with Aidan White, who founded the EJN about 6 to 9 months ago, doing a report. And they were kind of in despair because it's a relatively, obviously it's a relatively small country, but there are something like 60 broadcasting stations, and even the biggest newspaper was only selling, the biggest, most established newspaper was only selling about 3,000 copies a day. So any politician who wanted to buy a radio station bought a radio station. They weren't licensed. So the stuff that was going out there was just entirely, you know, to the purpose of promoting the particular cause of the owner. And it's that very old line, the only freedom of the press is the freedom to own one. And I think that's something we need, because it's one thing to go somewhere and tell everyone you shouldn't listen to misinformation, and they throw up their hands and they say, well, listen, you don't understand the circumstances in which we're living. You know, this is the reality of our lives. And so you've got to be very careful of going into someone else's country and saying you really shouldn't listen to that misinformation. You've got to have a greater understanding of that reality and work around that. And I think, again, and I know it's a theme in this journalism festival, but, you know, we're going to be talking about how do you support colleagues in Turkey with 150 people in jail. You wouldn't go to Turkey and start saying you really mustn't, you know, take on, I see Yavuz Baydar at the back there, but you've got to be very careful how you go about this. If you try to do it in too much of a kind of an academic finger-wagging thing, you've really got to find out how to work with the people, I think is, you know.
Yeah, and I just want to add a small perspective, because I think it's on, but it's not switched on, I think. Anyway, I will talk a bit louder. But you started to say, like, in the States, there is quite a lot of funding for these initiatives. And I think yesterday I checked the Duke's Reporters Lab map. They have a really nice map, and I noticed how many of these initiatives have now become inactive. And that's really an issue of funding as well. So, and if there's areas and specific countries where these initiatives die out, it mainly has to do with a lack of funding. Because you see in the strong countries, there is kind of a willingness, and certainly at public service media level, there are some resources to be put into that. But in some areas, it's a tough thing. So I wanted to add to it.
I think that's funding is a really interesting thing, and in the kind of proof of concept repository, we've tried to list who has funded each initiative, and eventually maybe we can start to map that to see where the money is coming from, but not just to do that, but to be transparent and make sure that there is transparency around the funding. I want to actually ask the audience now, and I was hoping you could do one of two things. Ask a question on global misinformation to the panel, or identify a key initiative that hasn't been heard, but that should have been heard, and lessons can be learned by others from. But perhaps keep it brief. I will cut you off. So I don't know how it works with the microphone. Do we take this microphone? Oh, you got one at the back. Yep, no, that's perfect.
Hi, Milica Pešić, Media Diversity Institute, London. One of the ways we deal with this in the field of diversity, we try to use different initiatives from street theater to complaining to regulatory bodies, to complaining directly to the media. But actually I have two questions. One is from the EBU gentleman, and I suppose Mira can help with the idea, and one is for the lady from ONA. How do you deal actually with your members when they use the F news or misinformation, or what London School of Economics academic would say, he sees the difference between misinformation and propaganda. I don't see big difference. So how do you use carrot or stick? Because we can see in the case of the Balkans, Serbia, Croatia, or Hungary or Poland, that propaganda is flourishing, and inclusion you were talking about is less and less there for public media, which are supposed to be very reflective of societies they represent. And for the lady from America, I'm sure you watched Zuckerberg talking to the senators, and it was really impressive to see how two generations talk to each other. And there was a question to Zuckerberg whether he would be interested in working with senators on the issues of regulation, which is quite new in America when you compare with Europe, which is very egalitarian and lots of regulations. Do you think there is a way to really come with some regulations for the ITs, for these platforms, and how that could work in the context of First Amendment? Thank you.
I'll start with the question about, because I think it's about editorial standards, and EBU has clear editorial standards that we also set out as recommendation that we use in our own newsroom, and that we also bring back to our members. Of course, we're not able to enforce it on a local level. We can recommend it, and we can also say that if they want to be fully part of EBU, that they have to inherit certain rules and certain values as well. We also encourage this by doing reviews of our members, or doing peer-to-peer reviews where they're scored on their contribution to society, and we're also looking at the specific values and if they're keeping that values. But I would say that's more I don't know if it's a carrot or a stick. It's more kind of it's a kind of guidance. But we also don't. I don't believe in a kind of punishing system on that regard.
Oh, go ahead.
We are a membership organization of mostly nonprofits, so our members work with media and journalists, and they all subscribe to our. Lan Williams is here, and he was working on our mission and values, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they all subscribe to our mission and values, which are opposite from misinformation and disinformation. So I think that's the way. Of course, it's not a perfect system. You will always have something creeping up, but there's no sanction.
And to that end, I would say to that question, at least at ONA, we don't regulate at all what our members do and what they publish, though thankfully a lot of them being very digital, the kind of the marketplace and the community somewhat shames people into keeping a bit in line on that front. But as to the question about what's going on in the United States and the conversation about the roles of the platforms, I think anyone who saw or read about any of the Zuckerberg's conversations with Congress definitely saw that the US government does not use social media. They don't seem to be very familiar with it at all, which is not entirely surprising. Right now in the US, lots of other regulations in general have somewhat kind of fallen away, that the regulation of most things is not a very top priority. So it's interesting that there's so much conversation about regulation of the social platforms, because it is an especially non-regulatory time. But I think that it's going to be interesting to watch what will happen there. To some extent, they haven't had to ask any of the difficult questions about what the effects that's going to be on the First Amendment. I know for those of us in the industry, and especially at the Online News Association, where I've been pretty actively involved in our legal affairs in terms of watching regulations and laws and court cases as it affects the practice of digital journalism. This is also a big issue for us as an industry to keep an eye on, because a regulation of social media could very easily be a slippery slope into the regulation of publishers in ways that people probably haven't thought about. So when I'm at various initiative meetings where people are talking about calling for regulation of the platforms, I'm usually that person that raises their hand and says, do you want the comments on your own newspaper website to be just as regulated as comments on Facebook? And everybody starts to immediately back up from that. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we have to keep an eye on, and that journalism organizations and associations like ours are going to have to keep an eye on making sure that if these things come about, which I'm not entirely sure they will, I think there's a lot of smoke right now, because there's a lot of stories in the media about it that people want to be able to kind of say they're doing something. We'll see what happens from that. Please no one hold me to that if that doesn't happen, but I'm very used to, I guess, my government talking about things that don't necessarily happen at times. But I do think that we all have to be keeping an eye on how those regulations might affect the freedom of the press, not only in the US, but in other places where regulations of social media could trickle down to be regulating all of us.
Thank you. I believe we've got a question at the back, and then we'll come to the front, if that's all right.
Thanks very much. I'm Nishant Dalwani from Midjar Network. Thanks for the really interesting discussion. I wanted to pick up on the point about social media. And I was actually surprised to see less discussion of the social media platforms in the main bulk of the chat, because there's actually hard evidence now to show that mis and disinformation is a much greater problem on the social media platforms, specifically Facebook and Twitter, than it is on traditional channels or the internet at large. So for one example of that is the Oxford Internet Institute study in France and Italy, which showed that mis and disinformation is a far, far greater chance of going viral on Facebook, on Twitter, than it does anywhere else on the internet. And I actually disagree with Mandy in that I don't think it's a time to watch. I think it's a time to act when it comes to the social media platforms. It's very clear from the Zuckerberg testimony that there is a huge gap in understanding. And in other sectors in civil society, let's say extractive industries, for example, there's been a huge role for civil society in bridging that gap, in advocating for particular types of solutions, in putting pressure on industries that are causing damage to society, in a kind of in an activist or advocacy type stance. So I was wondering, whether anyone is actually working on putting pressure directly on the social platforms, or trying to bridge the conversation between regulators and platforms, because there's a huge gap there.
I would say that we are very much involved in that discussion. There is, as I mentioned, this high-level group on a European level with the European Commission on fake news, and that's actually chaired by the EBU. So we're very much put in position there. And we're also in direct conversations with them to let them understand how we think, but that's what I mentioned before, trusted news and really reliable news should be more clearer for users than something that sits on another level. At this moment, you, as a user of Facebook, something that comes from a reliable source or something that comes from a fake news source sits at the same level, and there's no incentive for the platforms at this moment to change that, and that's something that we're talking with them. So I would say on both issues, we're really very much in dialogue and putting pressure as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. I mean, I found it really interesting at the session this morning at the Brunelfi Hotel, which is about morals in terms of the thing. So you had, I mean, apparently he's said it before, I haven't heard Jeff Jarvis say that he was a dogmatist for openness on the web. And then two other really powerful, Indira and others, no, we must act. But, you know, those people who've been in the forefront of digital journalism, and I think Mandy's a bit like that, they've had people, for reasons of optimism, have resisted this idea that you should come down really, really hard on social media. So I don't know whether this council is a body that should be lobbying Facebook or not, but I do agree with you, it is time to act. But certainly the first place to start with social media is in all those organizations. It's not just Facebook and Twitter, because, you know, having been the reader's editor of The Guardian, where we were getting 60,000 comments a day, we had to deal, when we had Glenn Greenwald, we would get 5,000 or 6,000 comments under Glenn Greenwald's thing. And then you've got a cultural problem, because the Americans are a damn sight more robust about what they accept as comments below the line than certainly the Brits are, or Europeans are. So, you know, I think, yes, it should start with the organisations, but whether this council should be lobbying Facebook, I don't know. I'd be really interested in, you know, what Fergus thinks about that.
It's...
I would like really to ask you a question next. Please don't go. Okay. I don't want to interrupt.
Sorry, then you have to ask. Why don't we ask the question now and then stack them up?
Sorry for that. I'm Maria Sadowska-Komlach. I'm from Free Press Unlimited, and I run the project called Russian Language News Exchange. I have a question to EBU. It's really great that you're engaged in fake news debunking right now in all these initiatives, but among your members is Russian First Channel, Russian State TV and Radio, Azerbaijani national broadcaster, Belarusian national broadcasters. They alone spread several hours of fake news on all possible platforms per day, including suggesting to turn us into nuclear waste and that Ukrainians crucify children and so on. You know all of that. So my question is, since you kind of stepped up in this fight against fake news, would you consider excluding them from the union because they violate the standards, or any other punishing measures which you're not advocate for? Or do you think it gives you credibility to have them as full-fledged members and doing possibly peer-to-peer review of each other? Thank you.
I understand the question. It's not my position to comment on specific members, but we feel there is certainly a tension among our membership. I think there's people who and members who are the best of the class, and there's members who might not always adhere to all the values and all the principles that we have. That's an internal discussion, and that's something that we have to resolve. So I understand your question, but at this point I cannot give you a clear answer on what we would do with that.
So the second question was to suggest a solution very quickly. I would suggest, while you may not cancel the membership of these media initiatives, you could at least make a statement saying that they do not adhere to the standards that EBU suggests against fake news. That's first. And second, there are also independent media outlets in these countries, like Stopfake, but even like the public broadcaster kind of doubles, like Hromadski in Ukraine and others, that do not have access to vast resources of EBU just because they're we're not members of the union, while the authoritarian-run channels have this access, maybe you could open up and open your resources and partial membership to these independent media outlets that really try to fight fake news in these countries.
Yeah, we're a membership of public broadcasters, so I don't think opening it up to everyone will be the solution. I think it's much more having a dialogue with those members. Having a dialogue with those members who might not adhere to all our principles, that's what we have to do. And we have to ensure that they abide to the values that we think are crucial for all the members. So we're having a dialogue with them. We understand. I hear your points, but excluding them from membership is not a solution.
So one of the things that we're going to do, Ezra, and I know you need to run, thank you. One of the things that we will do is, the very first discussion is how much of the public, how much of the repository we can make public, and the initiatives and the resources available to as many people as possible. But I think we've probably got time for one more brief question, and then. Oh, sorry. Yep. Oh, sorry. I didn't.
Yeah, I think it was an important question, and it had so many layers. I tried. I don't know if it's on. Yeah, now it is. I try to avoid speaking about social platforms because a lot of sessions here are going to tackle the same subject. But in terms of civil society engagement and our work, we had a discussion with a lot of our members on similar issue related to extremist content and how it can be regulated. And a lot of our members that include Article 19, for instance, argued that we should first look at the regulation that we have, especially in Europe, and at the standards that we have developed for so many years in broadcasting sphere, in content regulation sphere, in plurality of content, diversity requirements, etc. And for the first time last year, Council of Europe has developed a draft recommendation to its member states on how they should treat intermediaries. These recommendations are yet to be adopted, but for the first time, they have defined intermediaries not as whole entities responsible for different activities, but recommended to member states to regulate their activities in relation to separate levels of layers of what they do. I'm not explaining it well. So basically, Facebook would be responsible, the same as any other media outlet, for editorial functions that they perform, similarly to any other media outlet in that country. So they would not regulate the whole company, but just the sectors or the parts of it that are similar to other analog content. So read it yourself. It's a very interesting example. We are also talking to Algorithm Watch. One of the things that we believe should happen is greater transparency of algorithms. And I agree with Nishant, it's really urgent. And it's really urgent to look at them in terms of their impact on content producers and journalism. Facebook is just one of the examples. All the platforms and big companies have algorithms that are completely opaque, and we don't know in what way they promote the content. And insiders say that all the algorithms are optimized for easy things to measure. And at this point in time, we don't need easy, we need in-depth content, and we need to fight for it, and I also agree it's urgent.
I think it kind of gets to the heart of perhaps the optimism that you mentioned a bit ago. I mean, I think it's very different of how we approach regulation and kind of the relationship between government and media in the United States. I don't necessarily believe that regulation is the answer on the social platforms, because again, I think that the effects that could have on digital journalism are incredibly stifling in ways that is not the case right now in the U.S. media. It's not regulated in the same way, and I don't think we necessarily want that to be the case, but what I do think, and it's both wearing my ONA cap and my Storyful cap, is very much bringing together the right people to work with the social platforms on solving some of their problems. Now, granted, they have a ton of money, and they, you know, everyone might say they should be able to solve their own problems, but they're a little too into it. You know, they're a little too in their own business, that being outsiders and being observers of society in the way that journalists are very much puts us into a very good position to sort of help them spot the problems in the way that their platforms work, especially about how they could be unintentionally boosting the signal of people who are putting out disinformation. And I think that there are several great efforts going on right now about working across technology, journalism, in some cases with government, but really of looking at how we could be better working together to solve those problems without necessarily going to the government to solve them for us. And I think that is very much at the heart of what we want to be doing at ONA. It's about getting together, getting the right people in the room to work something out on their own. And because I think it is something where it's going to be a good problem to solve for all of us. It's the platforms want to solve this. They want to get the heat off of them. We in journalism want to solve this because not only is it key for a better society, but it's also better for us as businesses if the real news is getting the signal boost and the fake news isn't.
The purpose of the council, of establishing the council, was not to lobby the platforms, but because a lot of the members and by extension people affiliated with these founding organizations are lobbying them. But what we might be able to do is map the efforts to lobby them and see where there are gaps, which might be something useful. I should also say that this council has not been funded by any of the platforms to leave doors open to have free and frank conversations in the future. So I am going to leave it there because I have strict instructions that everyone needs to have vacated the room with 2 minutes before the next session. Thank you to everyone on the panel. Thank you to Jen and Wanifra, who were not on the panel but are represented here, and you can visit the website for more information. Thank you.
do I need? I need the...
Ready, get ready for...
Are we all here? Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Lee, and I'm the moderator for this panel. And we're going to have actually a series of 3 presentations and then open it up to Q&A. So the focus of this panel is going to discuss the importance of meme culture within the news and journalism cycle. And not only are we going to do this panel, but we're also going to do a series of 2 workshops, one after this panel, one tomorrow, and also have people come to dinner. So I'll make an announcement about that afterwards. But first and foremost, I'm going to introduce Farida Viz, who's up first. And Farida is the director of the Visual Social Media Lab, which brings together a group of interdisciplinary researchers from academia and industry interested in analyzing social media images. And she's also the professor of digital media at the Manchester School of Art. Off to you. There.
All right, is this on? Yeah.
And a new mom.
Okay.
And a new mom.
All right, thanks very much for being here. So this is a continuation of a panel that we did last year, where one of the things that we were really interested in is how can journalists better understand memes, and what are the resources potentially that are needed, kind of training needs and so on. So what I'm contributing to this panel today is a project that in some ways arose from that panel last year, where we specifically looked at the role that visuals played in the UK and French elections last year. And this is a collaboration with First Draft, with Claire Wardle, and the Visual Social Media Lab. And most of this research was carried out by Hannah Guy, one of my PhD students, who unfortunately couldn't be here, but she's very much present, as is Claire in the slides. So one of the reasons that we were really interested in doing this, and this is the work that we do in the lab, is to better understand the role of images in society. And given the kind of discussions around mis and disinformation, one of the things that we felt was happening a lot is that images were somehow overlooked. So they're both really present. Everybody understands that misinformation can spread much more rapidly through images, both photographs, memes, videos, and so on. But how that happens, or why that happens, or which types spread faster, and so on, isn't really well understood, or there is an emphasis on particular types of images. And what we wanted to do is, what if you take these 2 big European elections, what actually are the images? And what are the issues in terms of people's lack of understanding? So how do you understand context? And when it comes to this potentially really dangerous vehicle for mis and disinformation. So what we ended up doing is we partnered with First Draft, and they were involved in, or they were running 2 projects in French elections and the UK elections, with Crosscheck and Full Fact in the UK. And basically what they would do is they, for the UK elections, they produce daily newsletters with the kind of most prominent mis and disinformation stories that day. And they had a number of metrics that they were using to kind of figure out what were the most shared stories. And particularly, basically, all of them contained images or were image focused. If you hear a baby crying, that's my 8-month-old daughter in the back. She was in my belly last year at the panel. For the Crosscheck project, there was a website which basically did the same. So you could go on this website and find out if these stories were true or false. So you've got 2 examples here. So in total, we looked at 95 of these image-led stories, 43 from France and 52 from the UK. And then what we wanted to understand is, at a much more nuanced level, what are the types of images that are being shared? So this is, we're academics, and so we were very, very granular and kind of nitpicky in terms of different types of images. So we had 21 different types. In terms of operationalizing this, I would say don't go for 21 different types, because it's really, really difficult to code for. But I can talk you through some of them. Then we looked at the level of accuracy, so what is actually going on in terms of mis or disinformation. We looked at the topic, the motivation. This is one of the things that we're very interested in. Can you figure out something about the motivation? Who posted it? Where was it posted? And what was the source? So for all of these 95 images, we try to answer all of these questions. Now, I have no time to go through all of this, but our report is coming out in a few weeks, and please approach me afterwards if you want more info. So most of you will have seen this typology that Claire produced. I think out of frustration to try and be much more nuanced about this debate. And many of you will remember that last year, none of us were allowed to use the term so I'm not going to. So in terms of mis and disinformation, this was an original stab at kind of trying to build in this nuance, and this is also then something that we expanded on, but specifically for images. Now, of course, there is a good chance that the images that you're looking at are accurate, right? So the first category was they're not false, they're not fake, they're accurate. Or they're accurate, but they're humorous. So the information isn't problematic in any way, it's not false, it's just given a particular slant. Now then we ended up with 10 categories where the information was indeed inaccurate. So potentially humorous, so this is Theresa May going live, and lots of angry faces immediately popping up. So this is obviously kind of a parody. It can also be misleading content, so that the use of the information is to frame something in a particular way. So some of it might be true, some of the visuals might be real, but it's framed in a way that is very much in terms of kind of agenda setting, so giving a very particular slant to it, but not necessarily humorous. Then there's imposter content, where the information is there's a pretense that it's genuine. So in this case, Marine Le Pen is seen potentially as the source of this information, but it's someone impersonating her. Manipulated content, where in this case is an example of Damien Green in the UK, where parts were taken from an interview that he did, but then what is actually highlighted is manipulated in order to, in this case, to kind of give the impression that he's keen to damage workers' rights. So bits of it come from a genuine interview, and then it's taken out of context with particular emphasis. So it's manipulated. Then there's straight up fabrication. So this was in the aftermath of the Manchester bombings, where Ariana Grande was purported to who would pay for the funerals of the victims. This was completely false, but this is presented as coming from some of her Twitter news accounts. So this is 100% false. Then, and this happens a lot with infographics, false connections, where the headlines, the visuals, and the captions don't support the content. So what you end up with is this really complex layer of trying to figure out which bits are truthful, which bits are manipulated potentially, or how are they connected in terms of what they're trying to present. And we see this a lot with the visualizations. False context, this was the largest category. This potentially comes as no surprise to the people in this room, where the image, and this is really important, the image is truthful. The image is not altered. The image is technically real. But it's the context that is false. So in this case, this is an old image of someone walking around with what was suggested to be an ISIS flag in the French streets. And this was, of course, during the elections presented as this is what potentially could happen to France. So this is a really massive category. No context provided is another one. What you have here is often information that is really difficult to verify. So this is information, for example, what you can get is really old tweets dredged up. A politician may have said something problematic a really long time ago. Did he really say it? Did she really say it? And so on. Hard to verify stuff, so no context is provided, but it's potentially still very spreadable. Exaggerations, where specifically with statistics, information is grossly exaggerated or underreported. And again, because we're looking at elections, this will be to really kind of discredit political opponents and so on. So this is an example from the UK. And then finally, the final category. So you can see that we added 3 categories to the original typology. is a genuine mistake. So this is from the French elections, where again you get a lot of images saying, you know, how are the different candidates doing? But in this case, this adds up to 107%, right? So someone somewhere hasn't, you know, done the sums properly, and clearly, you know, this is wrong. So we have called this genuine mistake. Perhaps it's not, but this is what we've coded for. We've only found one example. Now, just to give you just a couple of minutes on some of the findings. So this is both the French, the UK, and the total of this. This is in terms of image type. And what we see is that the first 5 categories is the bulk of the data, basically. So most of the types of visuals that are used are videos, photographs, data visualizations, photographs with text, and then screenshots of tweets. And then, as I said, we've got 21 different types, and I haven't shown you all of these, but we really went into the kind of nitty-gritty, what different types of images do we find. And one of the things to pull out here is that image macros, so in terms of memes, and a lot of discussion is always around memes, and what is really important is that the kind of classic image macro, if you like, which is of course, you know, not what memes are. It's a much broader type of image. But if you think about that kind of classic image macro, this was only 3% in total of the data that we looked at. So this is in terms of the kinds of images. There is a much wider variety, but also in terms of what are really the dominant images, it is really photographs and video. Now, in terms of the level of accuracy, so what happened to this typology? What were people spreading? It's false context. So this is the biggest finding for us. And in terms of, you know, how can we take this forward, both for journalists, but also potentially for the platforms? This is the stuff that is so incredibly hard to deal with algorithmically. So in terms of verification programs and so on, you are not dealing with images that are false. You're not dealing with images that are technically traceable as false. So you kind of can't image cache them and say, you know, these are all the ones that we find, and every incident of that image is therefore automatically false. It doesn't work like that, because the image isn't the problem, it's the context. So if you think that 30% of our data set, and even though it was a small data set, but 30% of that presented the false context, the image in a way is not the issue. And I think this is what is the really difficult thing to deal with if you want to start thinking about how can this be taken further, how can platforms deal with it, how can journalists deal with it, because what you potentially have is new occurrences every single time. Sometimes the context might be correct and the image is correct, sometimes the image is correct and the context is false. So this report is out in a few weeks. We are planning more research, specifically also in the aftermath of the report that Claire and Hossein put out for the Council of Europe, and I can speak more to that in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Viz. Next up is Anne Chaumina, who's actually the author of an upcoming book on memes called Memes to Movements, How the World's Most Viral Media is Changing Social Protests and Power, and it'll be out in January of 2019. But Anne is also a technologist and an artist. She leads the product team at Medan, where they're building Check, a platform for collaboratively verifying news in real time, and Bridge, a platform for translating social media and message app content. She also is the project lead at the Credibility Coalition, which is an effort to develop a standard for assessing content credibility online.
Thank you, Jenny. So I wanted to talk a little bit, kind of continue this conversation around context and around imagery, and look at some kind of the broader media context in which we look at a lot of images online. And this is based on a talk I actually gave at Sheffield with Frida's lab, and then also some of the writings I've been doing in my book. And so I'm talking here about politics and fandoms because part of my concern, as we're working on misinformation, is that in addition to thinking about information, we should also be thinking about issues around emotions, narrative, and identity, and that the language of fandoms might help us there in terms of figuring out potential approaches. A few months ago, there's this kind of energy in the United States about Oprah 2020. Oprah given a very powerful speech at the Golden Globes, and people were really thrilled about this idea. And there's a number of memes about this. And I think what really clicked for me was this notion that that Oprah was much more than a meme, obviously, and that she's a brand. She's a very, very transmedia brand. She has a magazine, she has a book, she's in movies, she has events, she has food, she has fashion. There are many gifts that people make about her. And so Oprah, in many ways, looks a lot like Trump as the brand in terms of someone who is omnipresent, who crosses all types of media and experiences. And it got me thinking of that maybe contemporary fandom, fandom, which is the idea that people who like a brand engage with that brand and that the brand engages back, is a more useful framework for looking at some contemporary politicians' media strategies and also how people respond to them. So in other words, we need to start taking Kim Kardashian, Grumpy Cat, The Walking Dead more seriously to understand why are these types of media really popular, and how are politicians, how are people engaging in politics, leveraging these techniques, and what can we learn from that? So Henry Jenkins has a nice definition, and I'll just read the top one, but basically, fandom refers to social structures and cultural practices created by the most passionately engaged consumers of mass media properties. I think we can all think of what like fandoms that when we think about this, like Doctor Who, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about Walking Dead because that's my fandom and that I enjoy. And I was talking with Penny Andrews when I was at Sheffield, and Penny has this great notion here that we see both fandom and anti-fandom of politicians past and present. It's a lot easier to send a tweet than to write a formal letter. And I think this notion of fandom and anti-fandom is important. This notion that you love a brand, and you also love to hate it, right? And that's actually a key component of how power works in terms of media. So when we're thinking about how Trump's communication style, and I'll just focus on here because of the American context, but I think a number of politicians around the world are using these strategies. We need to think about this in context of presidents, from Lincoln with the telegraph, FDR with radio, Reagan, who's a literal film star, and then the American Revolution with pamphlets. Presidents and people in power have to adapt to our new media environments and develop new strategies that are adaptive to how those media work. And Trump, as a reality star, as a former tabloid star, is adaptive in that way. So I want to show, here's Walking Dead, and here's Trump as a reality star. Some of the parallels I see in terms of branding. And, we could do this for Oprah as well, but just in terms of how Trump is much more than the Twitter president, but is actually someone who's omnipresent across a variety of media. So Walking Dead, how many of you guys watch Walking Dead? Anyone? Yeah, okay, I see a few hands, okay. As you know, it's much more than a TV show. It's the most popular TV show on cable television in the United States, but they have a broad social media presence, they have video games, they have a meme culture, they have toys, they have Walking Dead experiences, and then they have a Talking Dead talk show that shows after Walking Dead to encourage people to talk about the show. So if this sounds familiar, this idea of getting people to talk about you is how you center your show. One of the things that you see with Trump's communication style is this notion of narrative tension, of trailers. Walking Dead does this. They have a trailer for the trailer. They're always like leading up to the next thing. And you see this here with Trump saying, there's a calm before the storm. You'll be extremely impressed by this person. This notion of leading up, of getting people to talk about you before the thing actually happens is really key here. Trump is the first president that I believe where you can actually play him in a video game. Just like in Walking Dead, you can play the characters in The Walking Dead. And when we think about cosplay, are people familiar with cosplay, the idea of dressing up as your favorite characters? So it's very, very common with Walking Dead fandoms. And during the Charlottesville rally, I think we saw people who dressed up in that same way. And so this notion of fandom, this notion of engagement across different media, I think is really key to understand here. And to understand that attention and narrative operate differently in the 21st century. Media is mimetic, it is remixed, transformed, it's transmedia, it's digital broadcast events, experiences, products. It's not just about the digital experience, it's about this entire transmedia experience that both Oprah and Trump, I think, are really like masters of. And so when we look at something like Covfefe, that tweet, right? We all remember this, yeah? The memes that came out of that were also interesting. And the fact, though, that Trump embraced the typo, who can figure out the true meaning and joy, is part of this fandom, part of that anti-fandom. And when you think about, this is data from Google News Lab visualized by Axios about the most searched terms during 2017. You see all these different spikes. One of the interesting things here was when you look here, look at beautiful chocolate cake, look at Covfefe, and see how they get, you get these spikes alongside, very serious policy issues like the transgender military ban, Sean Spicer, and indeed the most searched for topics of 2017 were the Women's March, number 2, and the number 3 was Covfefe. So the largest protest in United States history got about as much search attention as a typo from the president. And so in terms of the ability to embrace meme culture and embrace people's tendencies to want to talk about you, it's a really powerful way to drive attention. And indeed, with social media dynamics, to drive headlines, you pull attention rather than pushing agendas. This is kind of the new adaptive strategy that we're seeing with a number of other political leaders. And so when Trump is retweeting memes, whether that's a Pepe meme or the CNN GIF, we should start asking what role do journalists play in amplifying these agendas, these messages? What happens when these memes become part of literally front page news? To what extent, how are journalists framing these stories? How might they be inadvertently amplifying certain stories? And what is the intentionality that journalists bring here, in addition to just the images themselves? And so I think we should ask that as a community. And in a world of pull dynamics, controversy is often the best way to set an agenda. Again, who is the brand you love and the brand you love to hate? It's controversy is the way to get everyone to talk about you. So when we think about the NFL protests, take a knee, hashtag take a knee, it's this, this notion that there were two sides of this camp. It reminded me a lot of the blue-gold dress, that visible disagreement, whether it's a blue dress or is it a gold dress, the fact that you visibly disagree with each other is a way to fuel attention and agenda setting, that this became one of the most viral images of its time, I forgot the exact year, but that dynamic is, I think it's important to understand. And when we're looking at some of the propaganda strategies that have come out around from Russian propagandists, is that notion of creating tension is one way to set agenda. Similarly, when during the take a knee, there was less attention to Puerto Rico at the time, and as soon as Trump started paying attention to that, just talking about that, creating tension around that, that's when you started to see spikes in attention. And so, thinking about how politicians and others use these techniques to drive media agendas, I think is an important part of this conversation. So I think focusing on mis-dis and accurate information is an extremely necessary step. It's absolutely critical. And in addition, we need to understand emotion, identity, and performance in our online ecosystem, to think about framing and narrative. And this really ties back to this Council of Europe report. There's this one paragraph that I really appreciated, where Claire and Hossein noted that we need to fight rumors and conspiracy with engaging and powerful narratives that leverage the same techniques of disinformation, of provoking emotional response, repetition, strong visual aspect, powerful narrative. In other words, creating new narratives in the way that narratives are built in the 21st century, which is transmedia, it's emotive, it engages people. And so when we think about Covfefe, right, this is, it's one of many memes that people, even in the resistance to Trump, have used his language. And this is what mastery of attention and narrative looks like in the 21st century, where you have the fandom and the anti-fandom. And that's a way to set the agenda. And how do we try to drive new narratives? What is the way to take control as journalists, as storytellers, to understand the story? And so George Lakoff has a nice taxonomy of tweets here, and so much of this is focused on narrative. It's not just about attention; it's about the framing. It's about the story that one wants to tell. And so, how do we create new stories? And so, what we're starting to see in the United States with the emergence of the March for Our Lives is students using many of these same techniques to drive attention and narrative. And so you had a really powerful speech by Emma Gonzalez. You had misinformation campaigns. You had there's an image from her from Teen Vogue ripping up a Target image, and then on the other side is a misinformation meme that had her ripping up the Constitution. Right, so it's a Photoshop remix, and it was part of a number of conspiracy theories that were floating around about this, about crisis actors, the deep state. But what was interesting was watching how the students used a transmedia approach, developed a fandom, developed a meme lab that was featured in Vanity Fair, used marches and experiences, used products, used this transmedia experience to drive a narrative and to make themselves extremely difficult to ignore. And so understanding this, I think, and how these things work, I think is key for us. And so I guess I just want to end a few questions here, and in terms of moving forward, is thinking about how journalists work with emotions and identity signals in a productive way to build trust. That this notion of dispassionate journalism is something I think we need to question in this particular media environment. How can journalists work across media, transmedia, that engages audiences, right? It's not just about the article anymore. It's about so many different experiences and types of media. And also recognizing that we have now a new field of contention, which is this digital space. Different actors are iterating and innovating. It's to look at disinformation campaigns and also information campaigns and advocacy campaigns and understand them in a field of contention. And so how do we responsibly cover those and discuss those? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Get the computer up. Next up is Connie Moon Shahat. Dr. Shahat is the Newsframes director at Global Voices, and her work historically has actually focused on the intersections of computing and democratic life. So among the things she's done is work on developing software for the International Space Station. Her dissertation was in German history, and most recently she's also worked at the Carter Center, Emory University, and the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. And here we go.
Thank you, Jenny. And I just, user error, let's see. Yeah. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Yay. Good afternoon. So I'm here actually to share one particular case. We can consider it a case study. Let's see what happens here. Okay. But before I begin, maybe I should just explain a little bit about this initiative that I'm representing. It's called Newsframes. I'm part of a group called Global Voices, which is an international network of bloggers, journalists, activists from around the world. I'm trying to think about what it means to do less dominant themes in media. How do you do that kind of reporting? And Newsframes is an initiative to try and bring the data aspect to that, given all the new technologies that are available in machine learning and AI. What kinds of tools can be made available to journalists in collaboration with others to try and think about analysis? So just to put it in a nutshell, our platform as well as our initiative is about collaborative media analysis. And I think the best way to put it is that trying to bring together the expertise of data and data scientists with the expertise of local journalists, because to be frank, for those of you who have maybe already worked with large data sets, it's very large and hard. It's not something that can be done automatically. And that's a little bit goes to my case today. So the first thing I want to do is to share a specific example of an image. So we are interested often in user-generated content, and that information comes often in the form of images and memes. So let's go ahead and think about this one particular case. In Newsframes, we were interested in the problem, trying to think about false information that has been circulated around, and so we asked our volunteers from around the world to contribute examples to us to try and think about, can we collect a central database? And this is how we came across this one example. The full report of this is actually in this particular story. If you want to go ahead and look at those details, when a picture is worth 1,000 wrong words. But I'll go ahead and just give you some of the brief. And I would also like to say that there's just a trigger warning. The following images are graphic and contain violence, for those of you who may be uncomfortable. So this is an image that took place, this is a real image of an event that happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2010. And it involves a tanker accident in which over 230 people were killed. So again, happened originally in 2010 in the DRC. I can tell you a couple of things what it's not as well. It is not Nigeria in 2015. You can see, hopefully, that the same image is reflected now in a meme. This particular example of the meme was shared in the United States. Another example of what it's not Myanmar in 2016 either. This is coming from a Facebook feed shared in Arabic, paired with other real images from Myanmar. So just to kind of think about those two narratives. So we took this one image and we tried to figure out this question. Can we trace this how far can we take technologies to trace this and where could we find them? So with this particular image, we were able to confirm its location in either, I guess I'll put it, stories, false information stories, or actually fact-checking stories in at least 20 different countries around the world, and also traces in others. And so we just wanted to show that spread. So let me just make an observation about that. So it's not Nigeria in 2015, but also in these examples that we shared through this story, it was also not Nigeria in 2011 or 2012 or 2013. Other examples where this image resurfaced over and over again. And for those of you who are familiar with the rise of, say, for example, Facebook and Twitter, this is actually sometimes on forums. Sometimes you can see emails that were pasted to public forums. So we're not just talking about Facebook or Twitter. And again, with Myanmar as well, this was represented as an example of the Rohingya crisis in 2012, in 2014, and in 2015. So it's cyclical as it's happening around the world. These are examples of confirmed data that we have with metadata, screenshots, that we think that we can confirm these many countries have examples of this image. They happen on forums, they happen on social media platforms, they also happen on one particular journalistic publication with aspirations to journalism ethics. And if you think about the way that they perhaps first encountered that image, what kind of context did they have when they encountered the image from user-generated content? It certainly wasn't the original DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo picture. I also should mention that those were the confirmed cases, but there were also these many more that we couldn't feel absolutely sure of, but we also felt that there were enough traces for these countries as well. Just to kind of come back to that map. And the final thing I think is just a challenge. It's really hard to do this kind of work. This story, we could have waited longer, another month basically, to continue to verify additional countries, additional languages, basically, to sort of have language experts who could come and read these particular examples and tell us what they thought the pictures were saying and not saying. The specific tool that we used in this case was a reverse engine search, image search engine called TinEye. And one of the things that TinEye does really well, in addition to giving you a stable URL that you can kind of hang on to and share among a team of collaborators, is that it gives you sort of dates in terms of when a specific image was captured on a server, what that server URL looks like, and then from there you can sort of start to build some sort of arguments about where that country, what country is it located in, et cetera. And I can say that in a number of these cases, actually, we knew that some people had originally posted the image as real news and took it down, but they left the image on their server. So the image on the server was still available, even though the news story had been deleted. So in terms of just trying to do that work, in terms of our Newsframes project, we're trying to figure out what kinds of tools could actually help us do that work. Is it worthy to do that work, and how can we do it better? We think it is actually worthy to do the work because, in general, for us, one of the main concerns has been the international dimension to this problem, and also the non-English aspect to this problem. I think basically from our community of writers and storytellers, we feel that the false information problem has been around for a long time. Its circulation in different kinds of social media networks have definitely also been around for a long time, but we're not having as much attention to that right now in terms of the heightened sort of sense of US and EU politics, especially in the English language. So how do we continue to think about these other realms in which the same information through images now are just being spread further and continually and recycle? Thank you.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. So one for Dr. Viz.
You don't have to call me doctor.
I know, but I take such joy out of it for Rita.
Yeah.
So the top category is false. So generally true facts, but false context in terms of the
No, true image.
true image,
Yeah.
and then false context.
Yeah,
So does that
essentially.
include, so the facts themselves, the text itself is generally true or generally false, or those kind of got lumped together?
What you tend to get is things that kind of connecting to Anne's talk, things that really push the button emotionally. So the example that I gave, which was ISIS in France, anything Islamophobia, anything kind of religious tension, so anything that is a point of tension within a particular society, that's what will be focused on. And one of the things that is also clear from research is that anything that is a kind of a metaphor that can allude to threats coming and so on works much better than kind of cold hard facts. Even if you can say, you know, immigration levels are this, or and here's, you know, a truthful picture, what works much better is things that really kind of play on the imagination of fears and so on. And, you know, and we've seen that in many international examples. And so that's a huge bulk of that top category, that you have an image that is, hello Finn, that is truthful, but what that image, in terms of the context, what it plays on is essentially fears and scaremongering.
And so, on some level, this also gets into Connie's presentation, does it really matter what the specific image is, given that there's a sort of sense of truthiness that when someone is posting it, the underlying emotion is you know, very real, even if that image wasn't. So if not that image, they would have just substituted, you know, something else. So it's sort of almost like an emotion in search of an object to sort of validate it. And in that case, how much can the cold, hard facts actually really combat an underlying emotion? It is so weird to see like a very big version of your head out of the side.
I think that you've hit on something that I think makes this stuff so hard to deal with, because what do you then enter into? People can't have emotions, or can't, you know, have fears or share them on these platforms. So that is a really, really difficult thing. But I think what is incredibly important to understand, and I think this panel has done, you know, very nicely with, you know, real richness of examples, is just to get at the complexity. Like, this is what you're dealing with, right? And this spreads like wildfire. And I think that's the thing that hasn't really been understood, or it hasn't really been taken seriously. And I think if anything, hopefully our panel just contributes to, no, this stuff is here, it needs to be dealt with, how can journalists deal with it, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think one massive difficulty is that you know, a lot of it is deeply emotive.
And I think the other aspect of it that's interesting for us too is that in terms of motivation, I think often right now in terms of the meme conversation, especially with the propaganda, there's a lot of negative emotion. But in our case, especially for these examples with the Boko Haram Nigerian sort of massacre, or for example, the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, a lot of the sharing actually are from people who want to do good. Yeah. And they're actually soul searching and trying to figure out how to respond to a crisis that's many thousands of miles away. So in that split second, when they make that choice, you know, I don't know. I think that sort of the motivation factor is something that's also makes it so hard too, right? In terms of trying to uncover. And at least I think at this point, there's no automatic algorithm that's going to be able to do that. It's still a lot of hard analysis. Can algorithms be built to do that? Maybe there's some helps, maybe there's some approximations, but right now I think it's a lot of hand analysis, or eye analysis.
And just
I think they have to like point away from each other as a trick.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. So just to build on this notion of emotions as well and truthiness, right? Is a writer I enjoy, Arlie Hochschild from Berkeley, as a sociologist, has written a lot about this notion of a deep story, that many of us live with a deep story that we grew up with, about, it's a narrative that grew up with about society, about what's fair, what belongs to us, what do we deserve. And when you're looking at a lot of these images, when, you know, moving, you know, in addition to the facts, thinking about its truthiness, what it speaks to. What is it saying to people, and what emotions is it tapping into? We have to understand where those emotions come from. And it needs a more sophisticated understanding of emotions that I think can be grounded in notions of cognitive behavioral science, that emotions are based on cognitions, on beliefs and stories. And so we don't have direct solutions, but if we can embrace emotions and understand where they come from, that they're not random, and they're not always destructive, but they can be productive. They can be motivated by people who want to do good. How do we embrace that? And how do we understand how they're actually built? Because there's a lot of great psychological writing about this, about where emotions come from, and I think we need to tap into that.
And in terms of, you've mentioned sort of the remix culture as a core part of this entire process, and I was curious, or I guess maybe we're all curious, on that kind of the participatoriness of creation as part of the entire process of propagation, and does it really matter? I mean, is truthfulness even a consideration when you're remixing?
I think the more important part of remix and understanding remix culture is the participation, it's the community. When people are remixing and sharing, they're engaging in a community. We think about this with music, with art, that you're building a community. And I think we need to start thinking about that as well. It's like, what are the communities that are reinforcing and evaluating this imagery that it motivates people to participate in remix culture? So yes, I think the facts are absolutely right, but it's really it's the community. It's the identity signals that we also need to understand. And that's, I think, remix culture, what motivates someone to just want to create something and share it for no apparent financial gain is social gain. So where is that coming from and why?
And so, microphone issues. So given that, as journalists, when they see a meme or something propagate, it seems like the meme itself is just sort of the surface manifestation of something much deeper. I mean, they tend to cover the meme itself, whether or not it's, Covfefe or Make America Great Again, or any number of images that went viral during the UK and French elections. So what is it that journalists can take away from what the phenomenon they're observing can show?
And I think this, I'd love to hear Farida's thoughts here in terms of the context, right? I think all of us are talking about context, that this notion of the memes are just an expression of that deeper context. And so how can you use those? I think there's one powerful way to think about this is how can you use these memes as signals for a deeper story, for an engagement beyond the media themselves. The media manipulation group at Data and Society has written a lot about this, that the charisma of memes, that their attractiveness can be one way to spread misinformation, because as I showed, journalists can inadvertently amplify a story that they didn't intend to. But you can't ignore them as well. So how do you go deeper? How do you research that? How do you research the communities and tell that broader context as part of this story? I feel like you guys.
Just to kind of build on that, I think they're potentially an enormously rich resource for new stories and understanding new audiences. And I think we spoke about this a little bit at the last panel last year, is if there is a sense that certain audiences aren't being heard, why is that? Why are their voices not heard within, our publications? It's not necessarily because those people have nothing to say. It's just accessing them and finding them may be slightly harder or might not be the obvious way that people write stories. And I think when it comes to this kind of stuff, this is one of the things that I think has real potential. There are stories out there. You just need to kind of find them and I think collaborate. So this is one of the things that I think all of our talks really highlighted. You can't do this alone, right? So what is the expertise that you need, and how can you build long-standing partnerships with people so that this kind of work can happen? And also, what kind of resources, I guess, are needed so that, when the next election cycle comes around or whatever story breaks, that there is some sort of resource that you can dip into to just potentially just kind of figure out, okay, this hasn't been seen anywhere else, potentially it's new. What does that mean? And the other thing, I guess, I would add to that, and this is something that happens a lot in academic research, is that we tend to focus on the loudest voices, right? So a lot of this is driven by volume. So when it comes to spread, we tend to only be interested in something that has, goes over a certain threshold. It goes viral when, and so on and so forth. But that's always volume-based, right? But if you think of what is in that kind of long tail of the distribution, it might not be the exact same image, but it might be very similar kinds of images that tell collectively still a really, really important story, right? And that might be very coherent, actually, if you just look at it through a different lens. And I think, and I'm just sort of telling myself, I'm reminding myself of that as an academic, I do the exact same thing. These are the most shared, or these are the most prominent, but actually it's that. But it's also all of that vernacular stuff that is happening in the much longer tail that actually, if you look at smaller incidences and then put them together, they might actually outweigh the most viral image. And I think it's trying to figure out how you can do both. And also in terms of methods, the stuff in the long tail requires completely different methods. That's much more qualitative. That's your ethnographies, that's your interviews and so on. And I think if you can combine those, then you, I think, are starting to get at, what is kind of happening here. So for me, it's also kind of advocating, let's not do this kind of standard thing, ooh, it went viral, ooh, very exciting, a million shares. That's only a small part of the story, and there's much more happening in that long tail.
One of the things I'm taking away also from our discussions is, to kind of think about this. Thank you. It's just this conversation, I think we're talking also about democracy and the quality of it, right? So one of the, on the same side, right, like one of the exciting things about meme culture and its creativeness is the democratic aspect. To extent, like one of the things that we're wrestling with also is user-generated content. And then how do we think about the reporting of events, the rights of sort of citizens to be able to self-report, and then the distance between sort of that sort of citizen journalism to professional journalism, which has different kinds of trainings and ethics, maybe explicitly espoused ethics and so on. So I'm wondering also sort of, because I think that theme is there, elections, and we're talking about Trump, and also just sort of the ways that people are kind of thinking about the politics of image. When it comes to memes, when it comes to misinformation, some of these memes, as we are all trying to figure out how to classify too, like to what extent is like, that is perhaps a very distasteful opinion, but it is an opinion in the democratic space. That kind of sort of trying to figure out how to classify something like that in a society that has a lot of avenues to have media discussion is one thing, versus, for example, another kind of context, Myanmar, or Nepal, which there aren't as many, sort of like the rate of literacy is different. So images have a completely different power in countries and politics where there are less rates of literacy. These kinds of things, trying to think about them at a local, cultural, regional level, like I think we just have a lot of challenges before us.
I want to add one other thought here about why we're motivated to talk about the most shared content. It's also we need to think about the attention economy, right? That the way that our platforms are designed to generate attention, and that journalists and our publishing platforms are also motivated by getting attention, getting those clicks and those ads. And so given that platforms and the world in general is designed for attention, how can journalists optimize their stories for attention so that they're not driven just by the stuff that is floating around getting the most attention already, but to find new ways, to what is the new way of developing the headline? What is the new way of grabbing people's eyeballs? And we're working with a group, the Verificado 2018 group in Mexico, that has this great slogan from AJ+. It's in Spanish, viralicemos la info confiable. It's make viral the reliable information. And I just love this phrase because it's embracing that, embracing the fact that that attention operates differently now, narrative operates differently now. And so how do you do that as journalists, while responsibly reporting on things, but recognizing that to bring attention, you can't just be driven by the fact that there are images out there that are already grabbing a lot of eyeballs. You have to start to work with that as well.
Does anyone in the audience have questions? Because I can keep on going, but I don't know. Are you guys all good? Then one thing that I'm actually curious about is, at least within Western culture, as we kind of deal with this like misinformation problem, it's often, at least in terms of what we're starting with in terms of combating, tends to be text-based and URL-based. So that way you can identify, either a domain or an article as inherently kind of sketchy or completely made up. Now the problem with the images is they don't necessarily live at a fixed URL where they're copied over or they're uploaded. So one is there's just a problem with kind of getting canonical identifications for some of these, and then two, the fact that they metastasize very quickly. So even if they're not exactly the same, they tend to evolve. And so clearly with your case study, you see it like metastasize in a very strange way across the entire world. So in terms of the Avenger style group that is collected to try to combat the misinformation and disinformation, are there any strategies that are realistic?
So I think basically one of the places that we have to start, at least, is just the recognition that already there is a lot of sophisticated, on the one hand, this is very hard. On the other hand, the sort of analyses or algorithms that are currently being built, say for example by Google in terms of image analysis, is growing every single day, right? So the number of machine algorithms that are being fed constant levels of image. Some of you may have seen certain coverage. Yeah, some of you may have seen, for example, some stories related to bias in algorithms having to do with race, for example. Or one example that I saw recently had to do with, you can actually, in Google Video, for example, and these data sets are also available. They're trying to be more transparent. You can actually download them themselves. They're also trying to train the automatic visual detection of moving images, right? So one example I saw yesterday was how Google's trying to train algorithms to see a person carrying a baby. When the person actually started looking at some of the examples of the code, all of the examples about the carrying baby were by women. They're women carrying babies. There are no men carrying babies, but there are actually increasing numbers of men who also carry babies. So I think one of the questions that we have is like, as we try to think about using the tools, let's say like, as a journalist, all of this stuff like that automatically comes to us via these algorithms. On the one hand, it is amazing, right? That you can actually, the technology it takes to recognize a cat, like that is an amazing amount of technology that now we kind of take for granted. So I guess I would say that we have to start somewhere. We have to start at least trying to classify and identify images in a more sophisticated way that we can perhaps feed back into some of these algorithms, and that potentially we can have some tools in the future. That's sort of, I think, where we are right now.
Hi, I'm with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and obviously we track this kind of information very closely. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the broader psychological effect of this kind of disinformation and misinformation. Certainly part of what I'm wrestling with is the psychological response that we're seeing as profoundly authoritarian, especially from misinformation. And Dr. Meany, you mentioned the importance of supporting democracy through proper information. And I wondered if you would mind talking about that.
So I think there's kind of two thoughts I have for that right now. One is that wouldn't you, here's a question back to you. Do you think that we're all a little depressed right now? And I asked this because I was talking to someone at The Guardian yesterday, and they entered with the year with a profound sense of despair, right? And so thinking about how to coverage the news, they have now a new series called The Upside. I don't know if anyone has seen this. But it's an explicit effort to sort of sit there and say, we do a lot of coverage on things seem really dark right now, but aren't there points of light? Aren't there examples that we can kind of go to and think about solutions, think about ways that, yes, things are hard, but certainly there must be a way forward. And actually, interestingly enough, with the tools that we are able to leverage through our partnerships with MIT and Harvard, as well as Georgia Tech, I will say, though, that when we look at, for example, English language news, because those are the best algorithms that we have available, when it comes to talking about teens or women or a number of different subjects, the general thread of news is to cover it in negative terms. So, for example, in a recent story that we did on how teens are, and this is not just in the US or Canada or the UK, this is English language news worldwide. When you talk about teens, the most common terms are murder, drugs, etc., right? Is there something about our reporting that we're gravitating towards very negative events? Perhaps that's part of the journalistic ethic to try and speak truth to power, right? That makes sense. But is there an aspect to the speaking truth to power that also may now, in this new kind of information flood, ask journalists, should we also be thinking about the solutions that are available as well? So those are a couple of different thoughts that I have right now. I swing myself in terms of the spectrum, but I think you definitely have people who feel the same way and are trying to figure out how to have more optimism and hope.
And just to add there, I think we're seeing this rise in memes and emotions around authoritarianism and hate. I think we need to recognize that. It's in the same context. We've seen the hashtag #MeToo movement. We've seen the hashtag March for Our Lives. We've seen Black Lives Matter. We've seen a lot of other kind of mimetic strategies here. And I think when we're looking, the reason I think it's really important to understand how disinformation operates is we need to understand why it's influential. I think what we're looking at is modes of influence in the 21st century, and that if we do not take that seriously, I'm not being facetious to say we need to take Kim Kardashian, Grumpy Cat. We need to take all these dynamics seriously because these are all modes of influence. And the fact that we didn't take them seriously earlier has allowed for authoritarians and hate groups to use these methods to spread a message. But what we're really looking at is media influence here. And I think if we understand how media is influenced today, there might be other ways to get to what Connie was talking about building positive messages and other kinds of stories.
Can I just add something? I think one of the things that's really difficult is that news is driven by events, and positive stories tend to be much more about processes, communities, and so on, where there isn't an immediate event hook to report on. So I did my PhD on the Palestine-Israel conflict. So terrorism sells lots of newspapers. When the peace process was on its way, nothing was reported. Once you have the photograph, the iconic photograph of the handshake, it's kind of like, that's it. Let's wait for this kind of, peace process to go belly up, which of course it did. And then, the stories start flooding in again. And in some way, that is kind of counterproductive to maybe what you want to hear about. Maybe you want to hear, actually, Israel-Palestine, things are good. There haven't been any kind of significant events. But that's not how news works. That's not what sells stories. So I think what we're also getting at is just the absolute foundation of how news is made. And it's made driven by events, and often, especially with kind of hard news, it's negative, and so we're up in that sense. We're up against a lot, and so the actors that you were talking about, they also really understand that in order to kind of get a positive story through, it has to also be events driven. But then what happens after that march? Does that news cycle then continue around this group of high school students? Not really.
We need to figure out a way to continue that story.
Yeah. And we can actually continue this conversation. Directly afterwards, we are actually doing a small workshop for any journalists who actually want to understand the idea of how can you use these memes as a sort of to dig into deeper stories. If it's a small group, which it might be, we are just going to go to Fresco, which is around the corner, which has great coffee and great sandwiches. There's also a workshop tomorrow at 2 o'clock at Hotel Rosetta, which is not in the event schedule, but you can email us from the listing online. And then last but not least, there's also a dinner. We're having a Mimi dinner tonight at Restaurant Del Sol. Restaurante del Sol, which has like a great view. And if you want to sort of like meme together with us, a group of us are getting together at 8 p.m. So thank you very much to our excellent panelists who come very well prepared with beautiful slides and intelligent arguments. And if you're interested in, workshopping with us, feel free. Actually, approach us right now, and then we'll try to get a good critical mass.